moment the retired colonel's eyes landed on the worn patch of fabric pinned inside my jacket, his coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared, the way you stare at something you were certain no longer existed in the world. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I told him it was my grandfather's, that he passed away 3 months ago. The colonel set his cup down very carefully, the way people do when their hands have started to shake and they don't want anyone to notice. "We need to speak privately," he said. "Not here." That was the moment everything I thought I knew about the quiet man who used to drive me to hockey practice started to come apart. My grandfather, Harold Keating, was the kind of man most people forgot about 30 seconds after leaving the room. He lived in a small house in Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of neighborhood where the driveways buckle in the frost every spring and nobody gets around to fixing them until summer, and then somehow summer passes and they still aren't fixed. He drove a 2003 Silverado with rust along the wheel wells. He drank Tim Hortons double-doubles and watched the Leafs lose with the same quiet resignation he applied to everything else in his life. No plaques on the wall, no stories about the war. If you asked him about his time in the military, he would refill your glass and change the subject so smoothly you almost didn't notice it had happened. My mother and her brother noticed. They just didn't care enough to push. To them, he was a man who had never quite managed to become something. He hadn't built a business. He hadn't climbed any ladder. He owned one property, kept to himself, and seemed perfectly content to remain invisible to everyone, including his own children. My uncle once said at Christmas dinner, loud enough for everyone to hear, that Grandpa Harold had spent his whole life standing still. My mother laughed. I was 14. I remember looking at my grandfather's face across the table and watching him take a slow sip of his coffee like he hadn't heard it. He had heard it, he just didn't think it deserved a response. I was the only one who drove up to Sudbury when the hospital called. My mother said she couldn't get the time off work. My uncle said he'd come up on the weekend, which was his way of saying he wouldn't come at all. I was in my second year working with the RCMP, stationed in Ottawa, and I requested emergency leave the same evening I got the call from his neighbor, Mrs. Beaumont, who had found him collapsed in the backyard next to the woodpile he'd been splitting for the winter. By the time I arrived, he was in a bed in the ICU at Health Sciences North, and he looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. Tubes, monitors, the particular fluorescent hum of hospital light that makes everyone look a little already gone. He opened his eyes when I came in, and for a second the old sharpness was there. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said. "Stop it," I told him. He almost smiled. "Your mother?" "She's coming on the weekend," I said, which was my way of telling him she wasn't coming, and we both knew it. He closed his eyes again. "That's all right." He died 5 days later. A Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of gray day Sudbury does better than anywhere else. Low sky, and the smell of snow that hadn't arrived yet. There was no dramatic last conversation. He simply became quieter and quieter over those 5 days until the quietness was permanent. When I called my mother, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, he was comfortable at least. That's something. I planned the funeral myself." There were 11 people, including me and the priest from St. Andrew's, a church my grandfather had attended every Sunday for 40 years without ever mentioning it to us. A few neighbors came. A man named Clifford, who introduced himself as someone who had once worked with Harold years ago and left it at that, stood in the back row and didn't speak to anyone. My mother arrived 2 hours after the service ended. My uncle sent flowers. I stood at the graveside in the Sudbury clay while the priest read, and what I felt wasn't anger yet. It was something older and colder than anger. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something and realizing you never looked down. After the service, I went back to his house to begin sorting through his things. Most of it was what you'd expect. Old furniture, stacks of National Geographics from the 90s, a workshop in the basement full of tools arranged with the kind of care that suggested each one had a specific place and had always been returned to it. In the closet in his bedroom, on the shelf above his hanging shirts, inside an old Player's tobacco tin, I found the patch. It was small, maybe 4 centimeters across, dark green background, a shape I didn't recognize, no text, no unit number. Worn at the edges like something that had been handled many times over many years. There was a safety pin on the back, and the way it was pinned suggested it had been worn inside a garment rather than on the outside. I remembered asking him about it once when I was maybe 11 or 12 and had found the tin while looking for batteries. He'd taken it from me gently, not urgently, and said, "That's just an old thing, sweetheart." And that was all. I kept it. I pinned it inside the lapel of my jacket the way he seemed to have worn it, because it was his, and because I didn't know what else to do with it, and because throwing it away felt like a small violence I wasn't willing to commit. My mother didn't ask about it. She didn't ask about much. She and my uncle divided the contents of the house over 2 weekends in November. I watched them carry out his furniture, his tools, his books. My uncle made a joke about the Silverado. I took the tobacco tin and the few other things I thought mattered, and I drove back to Ottawa. I tried to return to normal. Shift work, paperwork, the particular rhythm of a job that asks you to pay attention to everything and feel almost nothing. But Harold kept surfacing. The way he used to call me every Sunday, not to say anything important, just to check in. The way he would always have something in the refrigerator when I visited, as if he'd been expecting me even when I showed up without warning. The way his eyes looked sometimes, sitting on the back step in the evenings watching the tree line go dark. Not sad exactly, just carrying something. Something that had no name in any conversation I'd ever been able to have with him. I knew he'd been in the military. His discharge papers were in a folder in his filing cabinet, standard Canadian Forces release documents, nothing remarkable at first glance. His listed occupational specialty was in logistics. His release date was 1987. There were no commendations in the folder, no service medals, no certificates. Just the basic bureaucratic record of a man who had served and been discharged and gone home. Something about it had always felt thin. Like a description of a house that listed only the address and the square footage and nothing about the rooms inside. 3 months after his funeral, I was asked to attend a recognition ceremony at a veterans center in Ottawa. Not large event, just a gathering of retired officers and former service members. The kind of thing that happens in low-lit halls with good coffee and photographs on the walls that nobody quite looks at long enough. I went in dress uniform. I kept the patch pinned inside my lapel without particularly thinking about it. It had become a habit. The hall was warm, full of the specific energy of old soldiers who had learned how to fill a room without demanding attention. I shook hands, made small talk, listened to a short address about the importance of remembering service that had happened in quiet places. I was standing near the drinks table when I noticed the colonel. He was in his late civilian clothes, the kind of posture that doesn't leave you even after the uniform does. He was talking with 2 other men when he looked across the room at me, and I saw his gaze drop to my lapel. Not my rank insignia, not my medal ribbons. The lapel where the patch was just barely visible above the fold. He stopped mid-sentence. He crossed the room in the way that people cross rooms when they are trying to appear unhurried and are not succeeding. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was careful. "I'm sorry to interrupt." I couldn't help but notice. He nodded toward my jacket. "May I ask where you got that?" I opened my lapel slightly so he could see it properly. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away a few months ago." He looked at the patch for a long moment without speaking. When he looked up, his expression had changed into something I didn't have a word for. Not surprise. Recognition. The particular expression of someone who has just seen something they believed was gone from the world. "What was his name?" he asked. "Harold Keating," I said. The colonel was quiet for 3 full seconds. I counted them. "Harry," he said, softly, like the name was something breakable. "Come with me." We found a small side room, 2 chairs, a table with a water pitcher nobody had touched. He closed the door, and for a moment he just stood with his hand on the back of the chair. "I didn't know Harry had passed," he said finally. "You knew him?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "though that word doesn't quite cover it." He told me his name was Colonel Walter Chang, retired. He had served with Canadian Special Operations for most of his career, in units that did not appear by name in any public record. I asked him what the patch meant. He sat down before he answered. "Your grandfather wasn't in logistics," he said. "That was his cover designation. Harold Keating was an intelligence support operative attached to Joint Canadian Allied Special Operations from 1974 to 1986. He worked primarily in Eastern Europe and along the Soviet periphery. Extraction operations, intelligence handoffs, identity establishment for sources who needed to disappear." He paused. "The patch is an internal identifier. It was never meant to be displayed. It was carried as private proof of membership in a unit that was never formally acknowledged." I sat with that for a moment. "He told no one," I said. "That was a condition of service," the colonel replied. not just a preference. These men signed agreements that bound them for life. Harold understood what he was agreeing to. He agreed anyway. He lived in a house in Sudbury and drove a 20-year-old truck, I said. My family treated him like he had done nothing with his life. The colonel looked at me steadily. I know, he said. Harry told me once that the hardest part wasn't the operations, it was coming home afterward. I thought about my uncle's Christmas dinner comment. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone the day Harold died. That's something. Why couldn't he say anything, even to us? Because the people he brought out of those countries were still alive, the colonel said. Some of them had families in Canada by the time your grandfather retired. Some of them still do. His silence protected them. Not in theory. Practically, specifically, still. I looked at the patch in my palm. It was warm from being against my skin all evening. He kept it, I said. Some men need proof, the colonel said quietly, even if only for themselves. I drove back to my apartment that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The patch was on the table in front of me, next to the tobacco tin I brought from Sudbury. I thought about all the Sunday phone calls. He never asked about my cases. He would ask whether I was eating properly, whether the Ottawa winters were getting to me, whether I still liked the job. He listened to everything I said. He never pushed for anything I wasn't offering. I had always thought that was just his personality. Restrained, old-fashioned, quiet. I went back through his folder that night, the one from the filing cabinet. I looked at the discharge papers again, and then for the first time I noticed the second page, the one I had always assumed was a continuation of the first. It wasn't. It was a separate document, printed on different paper, with 2 lines of text visible beneath a section that had been redacted so heavily the blacked-out portion was almost the entire page. The 2 visible lines read, Release Authorized Understanding Directive 7G, Operational Designation, Category Exempt. I hadn't known what that meant when I filed it away. I knew what it meant now. I called my mother that night. I told her what the colonel had said. I told her about the unit, the operations, the patch. I told her that Harold had spent 12 years running intelligence operations that kept people alive, people who were still alive, people who had lived their entire Canadian lives without knowing his name. There was a long silence on her end. That can't be right, she said finally. He worked in logistics. Mom. Your grandfather was a quiet, private man who had trouble connecting with people, she said. Whatever this colonel told you, you have to understand that people sometimes build up stories. He identified the patch, I said. Before I said a word about Grandpa, he recognized it from across a room. Another silence. I'll call you tomorrow, she said. She didn't call the next day. She called 3 days later, and when she did, she sounded different. Flatter. Like something had been carefully removed from her voice. I looked him up, she said. Harold Keating. I searched everything I could find. You're right that there's almost nothing. She paused. I found one thing, a photograph in an archive from a community newspaper in Gloucester, 1989. He's in the background of a photo at a veterans' breakfast. He's not named. But it's him. I know, I said. He never mentioned it, she said. No, I said. I didn't think he had anything to mention, she said. That sentence sat between us for a long moment. I didn't fill it. A few weeks later, Colonel Cheng contacted me again. He had spoken with 2 other men from Harold's former unit, both retired, both now in their late 70s and early 80s. They wanted to meet, not officially, just quietly, the way Harold would have done it. We met at a Legion Hall in Kanata on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of gray February afternoon that makes Ontario feel like it stretches on forever. 3 old men with careful hands and the particular stillness of people who had learned decades ago how to occupy a room without drawing attention to themselves. They ordered coffee and didn't small talk. The first man, who asked me to call him Frank, had worked alongside Harold in a joint operation in Poland in 1981. He said Harold had once walked into a situation that should have ended badly for everyone involved and had talked them out of it in a language none of the other operatives spoke, without explanation, without preparation, and without ever mentioning it afterward. We asked him how he knew enough Polish to do that, Frank said. He said he picked it up. Frank smiled at his coffee. Harry picked things up. The second man, who had a hearing aid and a Montreal Canadiens mug he had brought from home, told me Harold had once personally ensured the safe departure of a family of 4 from a situation where the official channels had already written them off. He had used his own money to do part of it. He had never filed for reimbursement. Did he ever talk about his family? I asked. The man with the Canadiens mug looked at me carefully. He talked about you, he said. His granddaughter who joined the RCMP. He was proud of that. I pressed my hand flat against the table to keep it steady. Colonel Chang drove me home afterward. He didn't say much. When he stopped in front of my building, he looked at the tobacco tin I was holding in my lap. One more thing, he said. There are people in this country who are here today because of your grandfather, not metaphorically. Specifically, I know 3 of them personally. I won't give you their names because that's not mine to give, but I want you to know they exist. He paused. Harry never met most of them. He was never supposed to, but he knew they were out there, and I think that was enough for him. I thanked him and got out of the car. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute after he drove away, in the cold, watching his taillights disappear. The February wind off the Rideau was the kind that gets into the seams of your coat no matter how well it's zipped. I didn't move. I thought about the way Harold would sit on his back step in the evenings. The particular quality of that silence. Not the silence of a man with nothing to carry. The silence of a man who had decided, a long time ago, what he was willing to carry alone, and then carried it. I confronted my mother and uncle that Saturday, not the way I had planned. I had planned something measured. What actually happened was that we were sitting at my mother's kitchen table in Barrie, coffee going cold in the mugs, and something in me simply reached its limit. I put the tobacco tin on the table. I put the second page of Harold's documents beside it. I put the photograph from the Gloucester newspaper beside that. My uncle picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Where did you find this? He asked. It took me 45 minutes, I said. On a laptop, at home. He put it down. I told them everything. The Colonel, the Legion Hall, Frank, the Montreal Canadiens mug, the family of 4, the money Harold had never claimed back. I told them about the people who are alive in this country because Harold Keating had once walked into a room in Poland speaking a language nobody knew he spoke. My mother was very still throughout all of it. When I finished, she looked at the photograph again. He asked me once if I wanted to go for coffee, she said finally. Just the 2 of us. This was maybe 6 years ago. I told him I had a thing at the school. She stopped. I didn't have a thing at the school. I just didn't want to drive to Sudbury. Nobody said anything. I thought he was boring, she said. The words seemed to hurt her to say. I actually thought that. I thought he was boring. My uncle put his head in his hands. He asked me to help him fix the roof one autumn, he said. I said I'd come up. I never came up. He looked at the photograph on the table. He was 73. He fixed it himself. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, someone's kid was playing in the street, the specific sound of a hockey stick on pavement. He never blamed us, I said. Not once. That almost makes it worse, my mother said. I didn't argue. She was right. My mother asked if there was anything she could still do. I told her there was. We submitted a request through the Canadian Veterans Review and Appeal Board to have Harold's service formally acknowledged, even partially, even in the limited way that the category-exempt designation allowed. Colonel Chang helped with the paperwork. It took months. The acknowledgement that came back was 2 paragraphs, largely redacted, but it included his name and the phrase, "Recognize service of exceptional and continuing significance." My mother had it framed. She put it in her hallway, next to a photo I'd found at the bottom of the tobacco tin. Harold, at maybe 25, in an unmarked jacket, standing in front of a tree line somewhere I couldn't identify, squinting into what must have been a very bright day, almost smiling. We held a small second service in the spring, at the grave in Sudbury. My mother organized it. She called the neighbors who had come to the first one, and apologized for not being there herself. She called Mrs. Beaumont, who had found Harold in the backyard, and invited her to come. Colonel Chang came. Frank came, and so did the man with the Canadiens mug. It was not a military ceremony. Harold would not have wanted one. It was just people standing in the Sudbury Spring, which is mud and cold and small patches of snow that refused to leave, telling true things about a man they had known differently. Mrs. Beaumont talked about the way he used to clear her driveway after overnight snowfalls before she woke up. He'd never mentioned it, not once. She'd only known it was him because she'd seen his truck from her bedroom window one morning. Frank told the story about the Polish he'd picked up. It got a small, careful laugh from the people who understood what it meant. My uncle talked about the roof. He didn't try to make it a good story. He just said what it was. My mother stood at the graveside with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes very bright. She didn't say much. At the end she said, "He was more than we knew how to see. That's on us. But we see it now." It wasn't forgiveness she was asking for. I don't think she expected it. I think she was just saying it out loud because it was true and because it had needed to be said for a long time. I still have the patch. I still carry it the way Harold carried it, pinned inside the lapel of whatever jacket I'm wearing. Not because it's dramatic, not because I'm trying to make a statement, just because it's mine now and because it connects me to something I almost never knew existed. Colonel Chang retired last spring. Before he did, he sent me a short letter. In it he wrote, "Your grandfather understood that the kind of service that lasts is the kind nobody photographs. The people who do it well never stop to check if anyone is watching. I hope you carry that forward. I keep the letter in the tobacco tin, along with the photograph. Along with a piece of paper where I've written down some of the things Harold used to say on those Sunday calls, the ones I used to only half listen to because I assumed there would be more of them. There's a particular kind of grief that arrives later. Not when someone dies, but when you learn who they actually were and realize how little of the time you had with them you actually used. I'm still learning how to sit with that. I don't think there's a fast way through it. What I know is this. Harold Keating cleared driveways at 5 in the morning because a woman living alone shouldn't have to dig herself out. He fixed his own roof at 73 in the October cold because the job needed doing. He drove a 20-year-old truck with rust along the wheel wells because it still ran fine and he saw no reason to want more than what worked. He called me every Sunday not because he had anything particular to say, but because he understood that showing up consistently was its own kind of thing, the kind that doesn't look like much from the outside and turns out to be everything. My family measured him against a version of success that had nothing to do with who he actually was. We looked for the loud version of a great man and missed the quiet one standing right in front of us. I don't want to do that again. To anyone. So I started paying attention differently. To the colleague who stays late without mentioning it. To the neighbor who shovels a stranger's walk. To the person at the back of any room who isn't asking for anything, who never asks for anything, who has decided at some point that the work matters more than the recognition. Those are the ones worth seeing. Harold taught me that, not with words, with a tin box, an old truck, a patch no bigger than my palm, and 12 years of silence he carried so that people he would never meet could live lives they would never know he made possible. That is the version of strength I want to carry forward. Not the kind that announces itself, the kind that simply holds. There's a version of this story where I stay angry, where I hold on to the image of my grandfather dying in that Sudbury hospital room while my mother was at work and my uncle was making plans he never intended to keep, and I let that anger define everything that came after. I understand that version. There were months where I lived inside it, but anger, I've learned, is only useful for as long as it keeps you moving towards something true. After that, it just becomes another way of not looking clearly. What I've had to sit with instead is something harder. Harold Keating made a choice. He made it deliberately, at 20-something years old, and he renewed it every single day for the rest of his life. He chose a kind of integrity that asked everything of him and offered nothing back in return. No recognition, no vindication, no moment where the people who had underestimated him got to find out they were wrong. He did what he did because it needed doing, and he understood, probably earlier than most people understand anything, that needing to be seen for it would have made it smaller. That is not passivity. That is not resignation. That is one of the most disciplined things a person can do, to act from conscience when conscience is the only one keeping score. I think about Colonel Chang, Frank, the man with the Canadian's mug. These were men who had spent their careers doing work that required them to think clearly under pressure, to make good decisions when the cost of a bad one was someone else's life. They recognized something in my grandfather, not because of rank or title, but because of character, the specific gravity of a person who has decided what they stand for and stood there, quietly, for decades. That kind of person is recognizable to other people who have tried to be the same thing. It's almost a frequency. And then I think about my family. My mother, who was not a cruel person, who was not even an unusually selfish person, but who had never developed the habit of looking past surfaces. My uncle, same. They measured Harold against visible markers, income, property, social standing, and when he didn't register on those scales, they stopped looking. That was the mistake. Not malice, inattention, the failure to keep asking questions about someone just because the easy answers weren't impressive. I've caught myself doing it, sizing someone up in 30 seconds and filing them away. It's a habit built by a world that rewards speed and confidence and volume, and it costs us the people who are doing the actual work of holding things together in the quiet. What Harold left me, more than the patch or the tobacco tin or the letter Colonel Chang sent at the end, is the question he makes me ask every time I'm about to stop paying attention to someone. What are they carrying that I haven't thought to ask about? What have they decided to hold, and how long have they been holding it? I don't always slow down enough to answer that, but I'm asking it more than I used to, and I think that's what he was hoping for. Not grief, not guilt, not some formal reckoning. Just that someone, eventually, would learn to look a little more carefully at the quiet ones. He gave me 12 years of Sunday phone calls to practice on, and I didn't use them well enough. I'm trying to make up for that now with everyone else.